Welcome back to Client Success Matters, the podcast where we explore what it really takes to build brilliant client relationships and grow thriving agencies. In this episode, I'm joined by Claire Richardson-Critcher from As the Crow Flies. Claire's spent years helping agencies sharpen their new business approach. We had a really honest and insightful conversation about what's working and what's not in the world of agency new business, from the pressures to offer the moon on a stick in pitches, to the importance of setting clear boundaries and aligning as a team around your ideal client profile. Claire brings a really refreshing perspective on this. We also talked about the delicate dance of handing over from new business to client services and how to build that trust without overpromising. And we got into one of my favourite topics, the inner workings of client decision-making. Who really holds the power? How to spot the mobilisers and the shapers, and what agencies can do to map internal dynamics more effectively. Whether you're in new business, client services, or agency leadership, this one's packed with practical advice and honest reflection. Let's dive in. Right. Thank you so much, Claire, for joining me today.
You're welcome.
Can you give me a bit of an overview of your journey into agency new business? What drew you to this world and what surprised you the most about it?
Yeah, so I am one of those people that, well, one of maybe strange people that love sales. I have always loved sales. I started life in sales at about 15 years old. I was flogging timeshare out of an attic in Southend-on-Sea.
Amazing.
And then I graduated to the Strip in Tenerife, getting people into bars. And then I've ended my corporate sales career in one of the biggest and best agencies in the world, McCann. So I've sort of done the spectrum of sales, right? I've always loved new business and I've done the spectrum of it. It was a journey really from out of uni. I sort of did media and marketing in uni and found myself in media sales. And I stand by the fact that media sales is the best training for business development I think there is. It's a real boot camp for how to sell and how to sell effectively. And then after media sales, I guess I did find myself selling newspapers and knowing full well that digital was what was coming next, right? This is 15, 16 years ago, and feeling like actually I might get stuck behind something here and I need to get in front of it. So I made the jump into agency land, and it's the best decision I ever made in terms of my own career. I loved that leap into the creative sector. I'm in Manchester and it's so vibrant. It's such a buzzing sector in Manchester anyway. It's full of agencies from startup 1 and 2 man bands all the way up to the big global agencies. And it's a world that I loved, but it was a massive leap. And it was, that sort of question around what surprised me. I think the thing that I found the hardest to get my head around was moving from selling what is ultimately a tangible product into selling a craft. There's a craftsperson sat behind it, but ultimately what they are producing, whether it's creative, whether it's digital, whether it's client service, whether it's strategy, whatever it is, it's an art, it's a craft, and you aren't selling a product for a price. You have to respect the person and the craft well enough within the sales journey to price it through value, not through cost. That was the biggest learning for me, but probably the journey that I've enjoyed the most about it.
That's really interesting, actually. And it makes me think about how you do that in the pitch process itself as well, because there's a sort of this tendency, isn't there, sometimes that as a sales sort of in inverted commas person that goes in with a client, it's like, how can I want to win this piece of work. What can I offer you? Here's the moon on a stick. But the reality is that that's all great at the moment, in that moment when you're with that client, but that moon on the stick actually has to translate, doesn't it? So how do you avoid or strike the balance between getting a client excited about the prospect of working with you, but balancing also about what's realistic?
Yeah, the moon on a stick phrase is one of the ones that has been batted back at me many, many times over the years from the client services team. And new business and client services should never work separately. They really shouldn't, but it just ends up being that way sometimes, right? People stick in their lane and they're doing their thing, and new business sort of are out there knocking on doors, pounding the streets, or dealing with an influx of inbound. And they're two very different skill sets in some respects of where they come in the journey. I would say there's a couple of things with this that that I would say of note around it. So first of all is starting with an all agency mindset or an alignment around the ideal client profile, right? So if you are all fluent in your ideal client profile, that will pay back dividends later down the line. Because if you're not, and you've got new business, or you've got potentially even a sales partner on the outside, a lead generation sort of engine bringing new business in, however that works for you. If you aren't all working in pursuit of the same client, there are going to be some nasty surprises slightly later down the line. And the thing that I'm always super conscious of in new business, whether I'm building a strategy for an agency or when I was doing that role myself, is not having or not paving the way for the client service team to have to just wear this really strange hat at some point, because I've decided it's right for the agency that we should now be working with this type of business because I opened a door somewhere through luck. That shouldn't be the way it works, because you are then going to, ultimately, you're going to drop a bomb within the client services team at some point to say, by the way, we're now working with this brand. It might not be the right shape or size for us. It might not be the type of roles you're used to dealing with, but sort of good luck, I've brought it in. It's not a great start, and it's not a good way to onboard a client into the agency. So that sort of fluentness across the agency of the ideal client profile, and you as a new business person respecting that and delivering the goods to the client services team is really important, right? Because then the client services team are almost, well, I want to say waiting with open arms when they've got capacity. There's always a little bit of a fear that there's going to be an influx like a bus all at the same time and everything's going to need to be onboarded at the same time. But ultimately, if you're bringing in the right type of business, client services are going to be very willingly accepting of that. If you are trying to shove a square peg in a round hole, that's where it gets a little bit tricky later down the line. The second thing is about boundaries, right? So what I've found is if a client during the sales process and during those sort of scoping discussions that you're having with them, if you aren't strong enough in those scoping discussions, actually what will happen is they will become a scope creep client. That is what's going to happen. So again, talking about this respect of the craft and respect of the team that you're going to hand the business to, if you are protecting those boundaries and you're respecting the craft within the agency, then really you need to be able to have those mindful, strong conversations around scope. And within that, the sort of negotiation that comes back at you from a client when you're at the pricing stage in sales, make sure you get all of those things out on the table right at the beginning to say, okay, what are all your demands before we agree that final price? Because actually, if I agree a price with you now on a scope, but what I haven't done is dug deep enough or asked enough questions where I've understood all of those challenges or those objections that might come slightly later down the line, then I'm not protecting my client services team or the team that have to deliver that work. So setting those boundaries and asking all of the right questions, getting all the challenges out on the table before any sort of negotiation is finalised.
And that's interesting because I personally think that's actually where client services should be pulled in. So for me, I think that client services should be pulled in at discovery, because someone that's in that typical new business sales role, they don't know those intricacies. They don't know, if I need this for this to happen, or the timelines are actually this long, or what are all my dependencies. So if they don't have that person being able to speak like that, then you're going to inevitably set poor expectations. And actually, when I was working in an agency a few years ago, I worked with this amazing guy. He was absolutely brilliant. He was a brilliant sales guy. He could really build fantastic relationships. He knew exactly what he was talking about, but he kept setting these expectations and then handing over work to me. And I'd be like, yeah, but we can't do this. Budget's not right, or the timelines aren't right. And I now need to go back to the client and set new expectations. And that was always grating. And so I said to him, look, we need to change this dynamic because this isn't working. And he was very open to the conversation, which obviously helped massively. I then came into those conversations earlier. And I think some people think that it's a negative that someone's going in there and actually asking these questions or pushing back on the client. Exactly like you're saying about boundaries. But actually what the client is hearing is that you are already valuing that relationship and you're already valuing the output, and that you want to make sure that that works by making sure that everything is set early on. And I think that agencies that feel like there is, exactly as you said at the beginning, this sort of split between that's new business and then that's client services, and all we do is we win this, that's done, pass over to client services. It doesn't work. And that's where the client has that very disjointed feeling, that feeling like, I've been passed over to junior, even if that person is nowhere near a junior. It's just that sentiment, isn't it? So for me, I just feel that alignment between the two is so critical. That relationship handover happens much, much earlier on. And the client services team are like there in that meeting, being able to build that trust with the clients, but also put those boundaries in, as you're saying, make sure they're able to do that.
I couldn't agree more with client services being involved earlier on. And I've had experiences both sides of the fence with this. Smaller agencies that I've worked in where you do all have to sort of roll your sleeves up and the lines blur very much between the lanes. When I first started working in agency land, my role was new business or business development because I'd come in to grow in current clients as well. But I might keep hold of a client all the way through delivery as well, just because that was the capacity of the team at that time, or the relationship I built was really strong. So I kept hold of them. We were small enough for that to be okay. It was a little bit of a lean approach to it. But actually, the best way I've seen it work, and as I've worked in larger agencies, is that as a new business person, you are building the relationship from cold, right? So you're warming that relationship up from cold, unless it's come through a referral. But you have to be as valuable as you are to warm that relationship. You also have to create an invisibility about yourself. And I remember I had this amazing boss at McCann in Manchester called Sharon Palmer. She was formidable, but brilliant and, in all the right ways. But she said to me, if a new client asks me to work with you, you haven't done your job properly.
Yeah.
And I completely understood the sentiment behind that. It was actually what my job to do is to pave the way correctly for what I deem the experts to step in at the right time. Now, that might be a staggered thing. And, I'm not suggesting business development is an expert. I've made a career out of it, right? It is. But to the client, we aren't there to be an expert. We're there to be the cultural gateway into an agency. They learn about the agency through us. We can story tell about the agency. We can go through key factors, hygiene factors and things about the agency, definitely. But we are a gateway into the experts in the agency and paving the way for the people at the right time. So it's our job to qualify the opportunity. Now, possibly with the support of others, but we qualify it incorrectly. We bring in the right type of opportunity. But you're absolutely right. Client services joins that conversation as early as possible so we can start to slip away from the relationship. I see myself as the behind the scenes machine that you guys are still delivering the live client. This isn't a live client yet, but you're the face of the agency, you're the face of the business. You're part of the negotiation, you're part of the scoping, but we're the sort of legs underneath the swan that's keeping all of the behind the scenes going until we win that client. And that's our job to do it. But you're in at that point, and at some point we bring in it might be creative director, it might be head of analytics, whatever that's service line or that capability line is slightly further down the sales process. But I completely agree with the sentiment that there is no better person than client services to ultimately run a negotiation. However, it is teamed harmoniously with a great salesperson's ability to negotiate an actual pricing negotiation and the value-based question set and all of that we learn as part of our craft that allows us to ultimately go, okay, how do we value price this rather than cost it? And I would always look to my client services team to say, okay, this is what it's actually going to cost us as a business. These are all the dependencies, I think is the phrase you use, that I've got. Okay, then actually, how do we build the value-based pricing? We wrap that around that. And then that's what the client sees ultimately.
Yeah, totally. Going back to what you said earlier, I love that about as a new business person, you need to be valuable but invisible. Yeah. I love that. You're so right. And to be honest, I've been in an agency before where it wasn't like that. Yeah. And actually the new business person kept coming back into the account, kept saying, well, I know this relationship, I should be involved in it. And I kept sort of going, but we don't need you in it. You've got your lane. We've got this relationship going. And I do think it's disjointed for a client to suddenly have that person back in. But it's really interesting that you say that. I've never thought of it like that, but that's exactly what that role needs to be. And I think that's a real skill in itself, to be able to build enough of a relationship and build enough trust but you're building the trust in the agency.
Yeah, on behalf of someone else, right?
Yeah,
that's
not
what you're doing.
Not the person. So it's not yourself, it's the agency. Like they trust in the agency, and I trust you to pass, and I'll pass you to the people that.
Yeah, absolutely. This idea that, this is to the client, right? There's so many things where the lines can blur in a positive way behind the scenes. You should all play to your strengths. So in the work that I do with agencies now, it's about bringing client services, new business, studio teams, etc., together in the pursuit of something like referrals. How do we all play to our strengths? How do we all blend our personal contacts, etc.? So we should be harmoniously working together behind the scenes. But as far as the client is concerned, they don't want multiple points of contact. And they certainly don't want someone with a business development job title muscling back in just to have a sales conversation later down the line. That's not a valuable thing for them either. So as far as the client's concerned, we must stay in our lane and we must dip out. And any new business person worth their salt is going to want to get out and get back out prospecting again. No sort of great new business person really wants to keep hold of the client relationship, because it's not our strength. Our strength is going back out and finding the next warm or cold opportunity again. It's not actually seeing through the delivery of a scope of work. I wouldn't necessarily trust myself with that in an agency.
So you touched on it just a minute ago there in terms of referrals, in terms of getting everyone involved throughout the business. Obviously, client services, part of their role is also new business. So it's not net new, but it is net new within clients.
New revenue, right? Yeah.
Incredibly important in itself. And I think one of the things that people kind of struggle with is understanding what I call the sphere of influence. Who is it that they should be speaking to? But how do they speak to them? How do they understand the sort of the decision-making dynamics? I mean, obviously you must have a way that you do it from a net new perspective. Have you got any sort of insights on how client services can sort of use it, understand how to basically build that out?
Yeah. So again, I would say a great new business person would be part of the handover. So where I spoke before about asking value-based questions, that's part of our craft. Ask the right questions so you can increase your price later in line with ultimately what they really want to achieve, not just what's written in the brief. It's the same with the decision-making unit. It's our job alongside client services later, but our job at first is to map that decision-making unit or the sphere of influence like you spoke about, and to understand the types of roles within that decision-making unit. So typically you've got 4 types of sort of people profiles within a decision-making unit. You've got the ultimate decision maker, who in theory holds the purse strings. They might not be procurement, but they're the ones that would say yes or no to a new agency relationship or a new piece of work going through. But they are getting increasingly hard to get face-to-face time with. They're increasingly hard for a team to build a relationship with. Sometimes it's just happening top to top. It's the founder or the CEO of the agency having a quarterly lunch with the CEO of the brand or business, right? And that's happening at that respect, but it's a point of escalation, really. As you move down from the decision maker, you've got what we call a decision shaper, right? So that is someone that ultimately the decision maker is going to lean on to deliver it. They're the person that is going to get the thing done, whether it's a project or a longer running scope of work. But these shapers come in 2 different guises, and there's one that's very positive and one that actually can end up being a little bit of a distraction, either for client services team or for a new business person. So you've got the mobilizer type of shaper, which is ultimately someone that is actually going to get this job done. Now, they can appear quite abrasive sometimes in their questioning, and it might feel like you're going around the houses a little bit. They're being a little bit cold, perhaps, with the questions that they ask or the way in which they react to scoping sessions, things like that. But actually, if you go on the journey with a mobilizer, you're going to have a very good result at the end, because they're going to be the one that actually delivers it and understands where that scope begins and ends, the roles and responsibilities piece of the agency and the brand. The other type of shaper is a talker, right? And they're a little bit dangerous because they're quite deceptive. They can lure you in a bit with warm, engaging questions, and actually they can nod along quite appreciatively of what you're saying, but ultimately they don't get the job done very well. And things like scope creep, etc., comes in because they haven't necessarily understood it well enough. And then they have to play the card of we're the client and you're the agency, right? Which is the thing that we all want to try and avoid a little bit later down the line. So I would say the job of the new business person is to profile people within the client as best they can. So asking questions, if they've got a great relationship with either the decision maker or potentially one of the influencers within that business, digging around the people that are in there. What's their role? What's their agenda? What does the decision making unit genuinely look like? And you can frame it in positive ways. What are you up against here? How many people have you got to get on board with this for this to happen? What could possibly stop this happening? All of that sort of light questioning that allows you to build that picture up of where are our barriers, who are our blockers, who are our mobilizers, and who are those people that might get in the way. And then you pass it on as part of the handover. But that can mature as the account matures. A great key account plan or a growth plan should include this type of profiling of people, right? Who is our relationship with? Great. Who else does it need to be with in order for this account to genuinely achieve growth? How are we going to move ourselves from, it might be we're seen as a challenger agency, which is great, but actually we want to be seen as a trusted advisor, which is that real strategic top table relationship. Okay, so how do we move ourselves from one perception to another? Well, that's probably with having a greater spread of relationship across your decision-making unit and making sure you're not putting too much of an over-reliance on your talkers who are great for relationship, but not so great for increasing scope or getting the job done and getting that done well. So knowing your people, knowing their profile, and sort of marking the right people between people within the agency and people within the business. So those relationships become really human and real.
It's so interesting. I don't think I've seen that many agencies do that.
No, not many do. Yeah.
No, I have to say I haven't. And it's so valuable because as a client services person, particularly part of the account development plans, it's really important that you do start to do your stakeholder mapping, really understand who all those people are. But you're completely right. Of course, that part of that new business conversation would have been unearthing a load of those people already. Typically what you see is someone handing over what's the conversation, the background, what they're trying to achieve, that kind of information, but never actually who I've spoken to, what they're like, whether they're going to be a blocker, whether they're going to be an influencer or decision, nothing like that. So that's, I'm literally here, like writing notes down.
Well, this is where it gets so interesting.
Yeah, it is.
It comes together, right? Really, really valuably.
Yeah, massively so, because you forget how much information that you unearth in those conversations that actually can support client services with further growth down the line.
Yeah.
And making sure that programs, even simply just the project that you're running, run effectively. You've probably unearthed, exactly as you said, someone who might be talk the talk, but actually has no influence whatsoever on budgets or, how this program runs. And actually the most key person that you need to be influencing is this person over here that you wouldn't even know or think does, so it's that type of information is so interesting.
Absolutely.
Do you find that whether it's you or agencies, how do they typically give this information back over into the teams? Do they usually do like a write-up? Like, do they actually start to put in the accountability plans themselves? Like, how do you find that?
That's an interesting question, actually. So, I spoke at the beginning about the craft within an agency. So let's talk about new business as a craft, right? If you get your craft correct at, let's call it pitch stage, but some sort of competitive proposal stage, the likelihood is there's going to be some sort of face-to-face engagement involved before they sign off a contract, before the client signs off a contract, which means whether it's a chemistry session, whether it's a pitch, whether it's a tissue session, or all of those things, part of the new business craft is to profile the people on the brand side or on the business side, the client side. Any good pitch process, we shouldn't be sending any of our teams out to bat without that information. So this is what we know about these people. This is how they profile against a decision-making unit. This is what they care about personally, right? We're infamously stalkers, right, in new business. We quite happily spend our days, LinkedIn, this, that, and the other. Okay, they've just been interviewed about that. I've seen them posting about a charity they love over here. We should be collating all of this into what I would call a one-page profile. So in a snapshot, before you walk out the door and walk into that pitch, here's what you need to know. But also, I mentioned the term man marking before. When you're going out to pitch, there's typically a client service person. It might be a lead creative. It might be a lead digital. There's possibly even an MD of the agency or a managing partner, all of those sort of roles in the room. You've all got to have a job in the room, right? But equally, you are probably matching roughly number by number the people from the client side. And what our job to do is to say to you, right, Joe, okay, you're representing client services today. The person that you are best aligned to in the room from the client side is this person. Here's a one-pager on them. Here's stuff that you to know. So when you are walking in the room, you might be grabbing a coffee and a biscuit at the same time as them. You can actually have a very personal, engaging, warming conversation before you've even sat around the table. Now, it's not your job to do that. That's new business's job to do that, to pave the way for all of that value and warmth and experience within that pitch or chemistry session. But the output of that is the beginning of profiling. So it's about the people. It's what they care about. It's how they sit within that decision-making unit. It's even down to the level of how do they consume information. So someone that's from procurement or finance, they are going to be waiting for the detail at the very end of the pitch, which comes along some sort of remuneration model or pricing, whatever it is. They're sat there waiting for the scope and the price, and that's how they'll ingest that information. Someone like a CEO is ready just to hear a very sort of compelling, exciting agency story, and then looking for little nuances. It might be anecdotal experiences of evidence along the way as to these are the big brands where your mate works for one of them that we've worked with before. So they're consuming information in really different ways, but we need to appeal to all their agendas. So we would map all of that within our profiling as well before a pitch or a face-to-face sales session. So all of that type of information should already exist, unless you haven't gone through the due diligence of it because it's been a much quicker entrance into the agency. So it might be it was a referral, the brief sort of landed, and we've hopped straight into pricing a brief. At which point, I love what you just said there, Joe, about the new business person perhaps joining the account planning session just the first time round to go, okay, well, actually, we haven't done it to the greatest depth this time because it was much faster. It was much easier to win. But actually, this is what I know. Let me go away and use my tools to fill in the gaps a little bit more. But actually, here's some more questions you could ask as you build your relationship in order to probe that a little bit more. So I think just joining the crafts of client service and new business together there will always, always have a powerful impact, because ultimately it's people buying from people, isn't it? That's what we always say. And everything else can get in the way if you don't actually understand that person. That's the thing that will be detrimental.
100%, totally. So finally, because I know we try and keep this to 20 minutes, but it's just too interesting. What's the one thing that you see that agencies struggle with when it comes to new business? And what would you like them to change or to do differently that you see at the moment?
Can I have two things, but do it in the same amount of time?
Go for it.
So double D, differentiation, discipline. So differentiation, stop leading with credentials and case studies. You can't sell from cold with just leaning into these are our capabilities, these are our services, and this is who we've done it for before. You need to teach, and you need to teach about blind spots, things that are hurting them more than they realize, not pain points that they already know about. So proper, real differentiation. The second thing is discipline. So start mapping the intentional steps that work really well in generating new business and follow them religiously.
Well, I mean, that is the way to end it. Really great. Thank you so much, Claire. That is really, really interesting. And even I, and I've been doing this a long time, and I've done lots of my own new business, not in that particular role, but in client services. I've learned stuff there. I've scribbled notes down myself, which has been really interesting to think about, particularly, along the lines of what the insights that you're actually gleaning from all of those conversations, all the research. I love this because we sort of hint on an account-based marketing approach with how you do new business, really getting into under the skin of the people that you're trying to influence and get to know you. So it's brilliant. I love it. And it's been really, really interesting. And I'm sure that those that listen to it will have been doing exactly the same as me and scribbling away.
Well, I hope so. But you and I can finish it over a glass of wine, I'm sure.
Sounds good to me. All right, Claire. Thanks so much.
Cheers now. Bye.